everybody. Welcome to my channel, The Magical Solution. My name is Leilani. So today is Thursday. I know. Normally the book club is on Tuesdays, and today was one of those days where, we had to do it on a Thursday. Unfortunately, Tuesday was just too busy. I don't know why my live stuff isn't working. Hold on one second. Let me just get up in here real quick and see if I can fix this. Why is it this? Really? Really? Hold on a second. It is not working all of a sudden. Okay, just give me 1 minute. Sorry, guys. In the meantime, say hello. Drop where you are watching from in the comments, por favor. Where is this thing? All right, give me 1 second. I'm almost done. Okay. Boom. Okay. So, for those of you who are watching on, let's see, TikTok and Instagram, I believe, definitely head over to my YouTube channel or my Facebook channel so that you can read along with me. Otherwise, you're just going to stare at my mug the whole day. But yeah, so today we are reading I believe the 5th chapter or the 5th book in the chapter or something like that, of the book of Harmonial Philosophy by Andrew Jackson Davis, which is a compendium of all of his works, put together in such a way as to explain his sort of philosophy on spiritualism from front to back, utilizing bits and pieces of his work. Okay, so that's what we are doing. So let me share screen really quick. And let me go right here. Beautiful. Let me open this up. Boom. Ew, no, I don't like that. Ew, I don't like that. Ew. There's no way of making this better? Let me see if I can make this better somehow. They don't let you make this bigger? That's whack. That's whack. So I'm going to do it this way. I like it better this way. All right, give me a thumbs up. Let me know if you guys can see this. Hello there on TikTok. We are doing our book club as per usual, right? Except today is Thursday. I normally do the book club on Tuesdays, so I do apologize for that. But we in this bitch. So let's do it. Okay. So, chapter 5 is entitled Primitive History of Man from Psychic Sources. Ow! Let me just take a sip before we get started. Ooh, I have a wasp in my room. Oh dear Lord. Jesus be some raid. Okay, let's do this. As all mythological traditions truly indicate, Asia cradled the firstborn of the human species, sustaining them from the lowest stages of infant innocence to the extension of their powers and faculties. And until the change of their local habitations to other parts of the earth, the place was the interior of Asia, and the people therein were kind of primitive association or family. On a parallel herewith, there was located subsequently a second family of similar type, but of a weaker and more effeminate nature, neither so large in stature nor so considerable in number. The two became acquainted gradually and sought association with each other. The explanation is that there were originally two distinct molds or forms of mammiferous species, ascending concurrently toward the human type of organization. One had existed in the Arctic regions of Asia since the Great Revolution in animal types at the close of the fifth day of creation. It was with it was this which developed the human form characteristic of those who existed in the interior of Eastern Asia. By a corresponding modification, the mammiferae in the interior portion of Western Asia ascended to the effeminate type already mentioned. They did not discover one another till industry had accumulated social wealth in abundance. It was undeveloped and effeminate race which established communication with the older and more matured inhabitants of Eastern Asia. As already seen, the two ultimately formed one family. Two branches sprang afterwards herefrom, one emigrating into the lower portion of Asia now known as Egypt, and the other into the interior of Africa. They developed into large families, and one of them into a powerful nation. Those in Egypt sprang from a somewhat more matured stock of the primitive association, retaining the peculiar characteristics of their gross and powerful constitutions. They possess also great nervous force, sustained by strict adherence to bodily requirements, with abstinence from organic violation. They were not subject to disease. On the other hand, those who settled in Africa continued to possess the imperfect and delicate characteristics of the less developed members of the original family. There came a time when the dwellers in Egypt rose against the weaker nation, destroying nearly three-fourths of their number and dispersing the rest through various parts of Africa. Of these remnants, all trace is lost, and it is evident that they became extinct. There were thus left two nations on the face of the earth, in Egypt and in Eastern Asia. The former migrated into the southern part of Europe and were so far advanced in civilized life that they built a beautiful city of eccentric form. This new nation increased greatly in numbers, but the people, incapable of self direction, became disunited again. There were further migrations, and later on, two branches established in Central and South America, two yet more beautiful cities. Those, meanwhile, who dwelt in Asia set out on another voyage of discovery. At this period, the Pacific Ocean was unformed, so that it was possible for them to pass from eastern to western hemisphere and gain the upper portions of America. By then, the southern portion contained an advanced nation of the original family, whose migrations extended in one direction to Spain, in another to Yucatan, to the region now occupied by the Gulf of Mexico, and also to Brazil and Buenos Aires, as these places are known to us. They constructed here their cities of stone and other durable materials, becoming very much advanced in science, hieroglyphical agriculture, etc. But for a period of about 5 centuries, portions of South America suffered much from volcanic catastrophes which formed the Mexican Gulf, Caribbean Sea, and Pacific Ocean. During these appalling occurrences, nation after nation was destroyed. The inhabitants of the Yucatan had, however, extended their possessions almost to those islands now dominated the West Indies, a portion of the same nation being established in the region afterwards called Herculaneum. A city was built there and also in the region of Pompeii, which was a place of grandeur, pride, and arrogance. But then, as later, It was subject to volcanic action. Yucatan continued to flourish altogether for nearly 7 centuries. Other branches of the human family passed toward America from Asia, some reaching that destination while some settled in intermediate fertile places. And of those who remained in Europe, a certain portion settled in northern France. Centuries followed upon century, and Egypt became founded, as known to historians subsequently. A branch or tribe from Egypt settled in Jerusalem and Jericho. From thence and from Egypt sprang a colony which discovered Greece, and from Greece other portions of Europe, where people permanently, including Britain, it was owing to dissimilarity of constitution, as adapted to climate and food, to differences in habits and modes of life, to variations of advancement in science and art, to different kinds of ambitions, and the inhabitants of the whole earth became thus distributed. So it's interesting because in this particular take, you know, before the land masses were really like truly divided by the oceans, they were saying that humanity was already on this earth and that the actual Fertile Crescent, the place where humans actually originated, was not Africa but Asia, according to this particular piece. And in Asia, we see them start to move across the continents, and we see a subgroup move over to Africa and another subgroup move over to Europe. And then from those subgroups, other groups fanned out from there and moved into the Americas, etc., etc. So that's interesting take. We don't have any science to back that up as of yet. But again, this was supposedly, not so much during the Pangea era, a little bit after the Pangea era, but still when the continents were somewhat close to each other and connected. But according to this, it was definitely before the formation of the Pacific Ocean. So that does tell you that it's really, 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 really far back. And even far back, he's talking about how these nations had advanced technology, sciences, and language. Now that we have science of, that we have evidence of, so we'll see. Interesting. It is to be noted in the above account that as America was colonized from Asia, so its southern people migrated to Egypt, and there became a large advanced nation. As regards the origins of language, men began first to express their thoughts by the configurations of their countenances, and while this form of communication remained unchanged, they were united peacefully. But when artificial signs assumed ascendancy, the new mode of expression proved deceptive and unreal. Unity of thought and harmonious social relations were therefore disturbed. Objects corresponding to ideas were constructed in like manner, being figures and symbolical representations to express general thoughts. Thus, language proceeded from manual and corporal to instrumental formulation. But men experienced inconvenience through the want of a more perfect mode, more especially for the expression of minutiae, and these began to be represented by certain distinct sounds, governed by the natural suggestion of the thought intended to be impressed, and in order that the same might convey uniformly the same idea. The beginnings of a rule were established to govern vocal expression. At a later period, sounds were represented by hieroglyphical characters or minute figures and strokes. Such was the condition of language at the time of the settlement of the Yucatan and the adjoining districts. For an indefinite period, symbol I don't know why I can't say this today. Symbolical and correspondential language remained unchanged among the inhabitants of Earth. The next developments took place in Spain and in Asia. The first invented more perfect hieroglyphical forms, which became ultimately a picture language. Asia improved the verbal and grammatical forms and placed upon these a certain seal of permanence, which still persists therein. The monosyllabic form became, however, confirmed in China, where every character is substantial representative of a thought, contrary to the other tongues in which compound figures are employed. Primitive history conveys nothing reliable in respect to language anterior to that of which Chinese is the development. While language is connected inseparably with the origin of thought, it is still an external artificial invention, as such misleading and as such also injurious to the human race. All present languages and dialects have arisen in consequence of a misdirection of the sentient faculties and judgment which befell the firstborn of the human species. So long as they observe the natural language of the principle within, by means of figures, motions, gesticulations, and configurations of consonants, as already seen, they abode together in harmony, while the thoughts and affections of the mind had a real method of expression. But when they discovered their ability to produce intelligible vocal sounds, they lost their primitive habit of radiated expression, and with it, the perfect purity of their interior thoughts. Misunderstanding each other's thoughts and intentions through the uncertainty of sound, they became cruel, deceptive, and envious. In a word, sounds were not true symbolical representations of the thoughts designed to be conveyed thereby. So, according to this particular text, Andrew Davis Daxon is basically saying that our languages came from, hieroglyphic type symbolic language to eventually sound language. And then that sound language eventually moved into written language, but that this evolution somehow stripped away the purity of these original thoughts. Um, and I don't know, I disagree with that. I don't know. I disagree with that. I mean, I get that as we become more spiritual, the need to speak and the need to express oneself for the sake of understanding very complicated spiritual ideas seems to just disappear. When you get to a certain point in your life and you're on in a spiritual mission, you just don't speak as much. You don't want to speak as much. You know what I mean? So I can understand how, like, a lot of people who look up to certain spirits or who have encounters with like aliens or something, how some of the same common threads that you'll hear in their stories is that they tend to speak to you telepathically and not with words, or they tend to speak to you with images and symbols instead of words. So I get that sort of idea is very deeply embedded in our systems, and this is why a lot of our indigenous practices are usually done through oral tradition and through singing of specific songs and playing of specific music and instruments, because these things can convey spiritual messages much more deeply, according to us and our indigenous practices, than language ever could. And I don't know. I mean, I agree with that, but I also kind of disagree, because I don't know about y'all, but there are times where I am so blown away by like certain Japanese words that capture a certain feeling or a certain experience so beautifully and unbelievably that I'm like, oh my God, where I thought there wasn't a word for a thing, here is the word. And you just feel so validated and so good and so wonderful when you stumble upon these languages that actually have something in their dictionaries that represent an idea or an experience that other languages don't have words for. So just because we're not as astute with our language doesn't mean that it's not useful. you know Okay, so we're about to go on to book 3. I'm going to go back and read the footnotes of this chapter so that we can all be on the same page here, okay? Okay. So the footnote here, So this particular chapter was taken from the Principles of Nature, which is the original book. Okay. So, an alternative account, which is not in complete accord with the text above, states that the cradle of humanity, as the term is strictly understood, was within and near that portion of Asia which has since been named Turkey, extending to the region of the Euphrates and Tigris, and joining in two distinct lines to the locality where Jerusalem was built in after ages. A lower type existed in some portions of Africa. Those who dwelt upon the borders and in the interior of Asia were very large of form, having strength in proportion to the great destiny of their osseous composition and motions governed by the peculiar plan of their anatomical structure. They were marked by gentleness and humility and were social rather than intellectual, but with great power of perception and memory. Apart, however, from any noble moral qualities, male and female differed only in stature and comparative strength. This was the first class of beings that could properly be termed mankind, and it has been designated by the comprehensive term of Adam, which included lower and kindred races developing from the animal to the human type in Europe and in Africa. An associate tribe, being presumably that which is described as effeminate in the text above, was designated by the term Eve in the primitive records. Asia was thus peopled for many ages, but there were no vestiges of art or science. The place where they dwelt was exceedingly fertile, yielding many kinds of vegetation, being free from all cupidity and absolute deception. The people abode in unity, innocence, and purity. But under circumstances narrated in the text, they sank into a state of depravity, not because they had violated any physical or mental faculty, but because these had developed wrongly. Misery and impure associations arose herefrom, and misery and vice increased as the ill directed development continued. And at the period when this wretchedness prevailed most extensively, the people were obliged to leave the happy associations of their former days, the beautiful earthly Eden, and they were dispersed through other lands. Three distinct nations became established ultimately, one of them in the interior of Asia, one upon its eastern borders, and a third in the lower part of Africa. The inhabitants of Asia divided into two nations, the original and the branch, sustained close relations with each other and with the people of Africa. They were all legitimate children of the original stock, but differing in constitutions and tendencies, they did not harmonize together. One of them was inclined to peace and unity of action. They were kind to one another and to the neighboring nation. They were classified, therefore, in the old record under the name of Abel, an amiable and good man who followed the shepherd's calling. The rival nation, which dwelt upon the borders of Asia, possessed the disposition of the primary inhabitants, manifesting envy, retaliation, deception, tyranny, and selfishness. They were compared by the primitive history to an unholy man termed Cain. After maintaining relations for a period, the two nations warred together, but the combat was soon ended, and Cain, the overbearing and conquering people, usurped the wide dominion of the whole earth. So, this is sort of a play on the biblical ideas of Cain and Abel. And of course, this is a very, very like racist rhetoric that they have going on here. So basically, it's this idea that the nation of Abel are basically the Asians and Europeans, and the nation of Cain, which is evil, are the nations of Africans and South Americans and Caribbeans. And that, you know, during these warring times at the beginning, the winner of the war was actually Cain's children. And so, according to this particular doctrine, they had dominion over the earth, right? Let's see what other bullshit they say here. Okay. The alternative account, summarized in the previous note, allocates the communication of ideas by expressions of the countenance and outward physical signs to a single stage or period, being that of innocence and candor. The stage of deception and depravities supervened when primitive man advanced in artful attainments and began to exchange thoughts through the medium of vocal monosyllabic sounds. They became by this means the possessor of new power, consequent upon the unfolding of their mental faculties. The misconceptions and deceptions which followed are said to have been an opening of the eyes by which they recognized the condition into which they had fallen. Having a new power of communicating one with another, they clothed their real thoughts in false sheaths or deceptive aprons of obscurity. Without pursuing the subject, it is intimated in the alternative account that the age of innocence was that period described by Genesis, when the whole earth was of one language and of one speech, which speech and language was by means of facial and other physical signs. The use of vocal sounds is veiled in the sacred text as a confusion of tongues, as the result of which men no longer understood one another's speech, and were consequently scattered abroad upon the face of all the earth. When discussing the true origin of evil, in his other book, which is basically just a book of his speeches, it's called The Approaching Crisis. Davis produced yet another variation, not only as to the origin of man, but to the genesis of language. It is based largely on the text above, as usual, without reference thereto. The original language of gesture is said to have been assisted by a crude form of hieroglyphical language, derived apparently from vegetables, animals, birds, mud images, and objects worked out of stone. When vocal expressions came into use, the misunderstandings which followed are referred to the absence of grammatical order and intelligent sounds. The discords led to separation, and the race was scattered over the earth. The wandering tribes grew into nations gradually, each developing a different language. It must be said that the seership of Davis was not competent to grapple with this problem of intelligible speech in its origin and the product and of its attempt to pure fantasy. It is adopted in the present case to eke out a speculation concerning early ideas of evil by supposing a mythical chieftain who instructed his people about the doings of wicked spirit of the air. Interesting. What time is it? Good. It's only 7:30. We will start the next. We are now on book 3, chapter 1. The book is entitled Revelations of Mind and Soul, and the chapter is entitled The Outward and the Inward. Let me take a quick sip. The body of man is a form, and as such is transient and changeable. The internal does not change. The true man is inward. That which is outward, his form, is an effect. Mind acts upon body, not body upon mind. The reality is that which is within, and that upon which it acts is visible and mortal. Like other appearances, the visible is not the real, and that which is unseen is that which is eternal. Yet outward searching after truth and inductions drawn from the appearances of external substances have been regarded as the only way to demonstrate tangible realities. So, also, the external and manifest have been made the test of inward truth. The generality of men are convinced of the reality of things only in proportion as evidence appeals to their senses. Whatsoever is invisible and imperceptible is for them doubtful and visionary. The external tests of truth and reality are, however, invariably deceptive. Reasoning from cause to effect is the one sure guide to truth. And then analogy and association may follow, as carrying direct evidence to the mind of that which is beyond the senses. Cause and reality are within, without are effects and ultimates. Prove, therefore, the visible by the invisible. And if this should seem at first sight a reversal of the usual process followed in reasoning, which is inductive of upward from effect to cause, rather than from cause to effect downward, its justification will be found where few only might expect it, namely in a philosophical consideration of ideas. Okay? So ultimately, you know, ultimately the nice way of saying this is, if you're going to if your outward expression is the effect of your inward expression, then it would make sense to, you know, move through your outward expression to understand your inward expression and vice versa, right? But to be mindful of the fact that your external expression can always fall victim to deception. Okay? So, although what you see is what you see on the surface may not always be what's really happening on the inside. Okay? So you need to be able to have that discernment. Okay? So, here above all, it may seem that the mind of man is dependent on impressions received from without, but such impressions are occasions only for the generation of activity on the part of that which is within and invisible, being the mind itself. Every thought is an unrestrained production of the mind, acted upon by forms, reflections, sounds, associations, and so forth. The cause of all such is invisible. It is not the form, substance, sound, or word that produces thought, but the irresistible impression which these produce upon the mind. Woo! Okay, so please understand this for what it is. And I'm going to say this with my whole ass chest. Are you ready? People need ritual. People need the music, people need the ritual, people need the chanting, people need the theatrics, people need this stuff. Because sadly, in order for us to believe something, we must first imprint that thing upon our mind and then allow our mind to receive that thing as either truth or false, or whatever you want to allow it to do. So the point is that for the majority of people, in order for them to believe that it's real, um they must first see that in their mind as a possibility. If you cannot see it in your mind as a possibility, as an option, it will never be real to you. You will always doubt it. That is what they are saying here. And so that works the same way in ritual. It works the same way in ceremony, right? At the end of the day, when you're going through an initiation, when you're doing a misa, when you're doing a full moon circle, when you're doing any of these things that require, long-winded chants and speeches, dancing, music, costumes, maybe certain acts of trance-inducing activities, running on fire, um you know uh putting a needle through your tongue, all these things, right? These are all psychological tricks that we as a people have figured out. We as a people have figured out that we can trick our mind into performing miracles, into believing that there is a spirit in a place that may not have spirit, into believing in psychic phenomenon, into whatever, by stimulating all of the senses of the body, utilizing ritual and ceremony. And when you stimulate these senses to a point where you change the frequency of your brain waves, and you move from a beta to a theta, or you move from a conscious to an unconscious, or when you shift your mind from certain states of consciousness to other certain states of consciousness, you are then able to trick the mind into believing what it's seeing, or into producing phenomenon that uh, would not have been produced otherwise. Okay. And for many, many people, they need that. For some people, sitting in meditation is all they need, and they can have the same effects, right? But I think it's important to say that. Okay. So, moreover, no physical manifestation is produced unless that which is a cause or a prompter exists previously. But this is a thought. So the antecedent to the thought itself is the mind in which it dwells. Here again is developed the principle established previously, that the visible and external are effects and ultimates of unseen, though real, producing causes. But if we carry the consideration further and admit that no mind can be individualized without the previous existence of physical organization, it will follow that such organization postulates another antecedent, being elementary existence, the matter of the cosmos, and hence arises in its turn the greater and inevitable postulate of a self-existent, unchangeable, and eternal principle, the absolute of things unseen, the fountain, the sun, the great illuminator, the positive mind. Therefore, from whatsoever direction our start is made, we are brought to the touchstones of truth in all things, above or below, that the things which are seen are temporal, but the things which are unseen are eternal. Ooh! And as the mind, but not that which is without it, generates thought or ideas by coming in contact with external exciting causes of the local and temporal order. In this natural body of our humanity, so is there the great mind, which in certain states or modes, not local or temporal, comes in contact after another manner with the mind of man and generates impressions therein, thoughts and ideas, whereby the spiritual world flows through our inward being. And those who know this state by personal experience can do no otherwise thenceforward than prove the visible by the invisible, for there is that within them which is a link between the outward and the inward. Ooh, I love that. I love that. So let's go back to the footnotes. It's a very short chapter. Let's go back to the footnotes. Okay. So the limitations of thoughts are recognized, however, on several occasions by Andrew Jackson Davis. He says, for example, that deeper than thought is the fountain, that in spirit each is like all, and all are like unto each, but in thought each is individualized and removed from the other. By means of the inner spirit and the life therein, there is notwithstanding a meeting and melting together of thoughts possible, as between personalities. It is said also that the thoughts of reflective men are from two very different sources. One is spiritual, or from the fountain of principle, and the other is sensuous, or from the battleground of sensations. And while these are shared by us in common with the brute creation, we are not unerring therein, as the animals themselves are. The reason alleged being that we are constructed for unlimited development. More than half of humanity is dependent for its thoughts on the senses and is therefore in an unrisen state, cherishing no higher hope or faith. But when a man thinks from the ideas or essential principles of which his higher consciousness is compounded, his thoughts are identified with impersonal, sublime, and eternal. He discerns truth as an absolute, not a relative principle. Mm. Mm-mm-mm. Beautiful. It is 740. I think, let me see how long this chapter is. Let's see how long this chapter is. It's pretty long. It's pretty long, but fuck it. Let's do it anyway. I'm here. I'm excited. Let's do it. Oh my God. Oh my God. Oh my God. Here we go. The 7 mental states. Oh. Okay. In a natural classification of human mental conditions, marking the progress of intelligence from the moment of birth to that of the mind's introduction into this world of spirits, there may be distinguished 7 states. And they are as follows: the rudimentary state, the psychological state, the sympathetic state, the transition state, the somnambulistic state, the clairvoyant state, and the spiritual state. So the rudimentary state, we have seen already that man in his natural condition is superior to all forms and personalities in the subordinate kingdoms of nature. Of course, we are human centric in this religion, right? He is the splendid representation of all perfections and energies of the grosser worlds of life. Another essential point is the duality of man, that is to say, his twofold organization. The duality of his physical constitution can be perceived by all observers. The positive and the negative principles express themselves faithfully in the outer form and functions of his different members, from the duality of his hands and feet to the 2 lobes of the brain. All external effects being outbursts of internal principles, the duality of man's physical constitution is referable to a spiritual constitution, analogous to the outer form in every particular. So his physical body is a demonstration of his spiritual body, and the duality of the one extends to the other, but in a more perfect manner. Within both is that invisible spirit which is the real man, in virtue of which he is the connecting link between earth and heaven. While every soul contains the same elements, is capable of analogous manifestations, and is not therefore gifted intrinsically above another, so that what is possible and natural to one is natural and possible to all. An infinite variety results from different combinations of the same faculties, from education, and from the dissimilar circumstances by which parents are surrounded. An unbalanced mental organization develops corresponding results. One combination of circumstances will brutalize and another spiritualize the human character. Apart from education, a life may be replete with crude and unwholesome deeds and destitute of organic harmony. It may generate a whole congregation of inconsistencies and deplorable angularities. Such is man in his ordinary rudimental state. Now, the psychological state, which is the condition that stands next to in succession to the rudimental state, and can be attained in either of 2 ways, natural or artificial, which is to say spontaneous or superinduced. Spontaneous psychology is identical with natural mental power, but superinduced psychology means mental power prematurely developed by the direct action of individuals or circumstances. The relationships established by these positive and negative principles give rise to all psychological phenomena. Every man is psychologically influenced by something. Certain minds are constitutionally positive to one set of circumstances and negative to another. But all manifestations of positive and negative principles, when considered psychologically, occur according to the law of equilibrium. Any influence which disturbs the equilibrium of man's spiritual or mental principle is capable of of ugh, psychologizing psychologizing the individual. I can't get it. I'm sorry, guys. So long as the voluntary powers are unable to assert their superiority. Anything which disturbs permanently the equilibrium of mind carries the soul into captivity. Many are constantly psychologicalized by some passion or propensity. The mind is also frequently taken into psychological captivity by the physical organism. When disease has obtained a preponderance of power in the system of the mind and the system in the mind is disturbed by deranged psychological impressions conducted to the sensorium. So, also, the mental fear of disease renders the body susceptible to invasion by the dreaded enemy. On the other hand, the same psychological principles which can cause disease, when wrongly exercised, are perfectly adequate when employed rightly to cure or prevent it. There is also that aspect of psychology which is manifested in wars, panics, popular insanities, and sympathetic contagions. A word, a look, a gesture from some master spirit may psychologize a great assembly, and what is possible in the physical and mental world is equally possible in that of morals. We are endowed naturally with the psychological power, but in different degrees, and to exercise it is a prerogative of our being. Now, the sympathetic state, the philosophy of sympathy, is the tracing out of universal relationships to their source, and the seat of universal law is deity. All the external phenomenon are psychological, I'm sorry, all the external phenomenon of psychological principles are reproduced in the sympathetic state, with the addition of higher manifestations, and the philosophy of this influence is visible and applicable everywhere. Now, the synonym of the word sympathy is magnetism. Everything has its own magnetic atmosphere, its own medium of sympathetic relationships. Man, particularly and preeminently, possesses this sphere of mind, so to speak, constantly surrounding his body. It is negative or positive, attractive or repulsive, gross or refined, and of lesser or greater magnitude in proportion to his general refinement and development of mind. And when there is full and uninterrupted exercises of all organs and powers of the body, when there is harmony between all vital functions, the body is properly and thoroughly magnetized. The equilibrium of the positive and negative forces is not disturbed. The organization is in perfect accord with itself, and the individual is neither physically nor mentally under any description of subjugation or captivity. Setting aside the peculiar phenomenon belonging to induced magnetic conditions, the sympathetic medium interlinks all organic beings, and examples of sympathetic impressions may be gathered from experiences of all nations in every age of the world. The sources of these impressions may be the action of mind upon mind, emanations from material objects operating upon impressible dispositions, or influences of spirits who have departed from the material body. Many visions and strong impressions were received in the sympathetic condition by Jewish seers, and instances of prophetic dreaming, in accordance with the laws of psychological sympathy, or are otherwise numerous. And for the mind, which is in sympathy with certain current of events, may intuitively perceive or feel some particular occurrence which will result from their progress. So, this particular state of mind is really interesting because what it's talking about is your ability to stay balanced in a world of duality, right? So, what they are talking about here essentially is when you perceive the world, when you perceive yourself, when you perceive others, are you looking at it from a negative standpoint or a positive standpoint? Because whatever your perception is, whatever your psychology is at that time, it is going to hold your spirit captive in whatever direction. And when you are in homeostasis, both psychologically, spiritually, morally, physically, and that includes what you're eating, how you're exercising, how you're moving, and all that. When you are in homeostasis, when you are in balance in all of those areas of your life, you have you are in a state of magnetization. You are electromagnetically emanating light, and therefore you can perform certain feats that a magnetizer can perform, and we'll talk about that at some later time. The next state is called the transition state. Okay, and this is the intermediate between the sympathetic state and the opening of the interior or spiritual senses lies one which may be called transitional. So between interior or spiritual senses, okay, and the sympathetic state, okay. So categorized by neither absolute sympathy nor absolute perception, but by the interblending of one condition with the other to the confusion of both. There is constant fluctuation between two extremes. The mind indicates a distinct vision at one moment and utters at another the impressions of its own memory, or will lose its individuality in sympathy with minds or circumstances which surround it. It is not clairvoyant, neither is it occupying a position from which the soul can discern the broad territories of the spirit land. The state is one of fluctuation, of passing from extreme sympathy with surrounding things to communion with inward elements and prepossessions of one's own mind, which are magnified to an extent almost beyond belief. Okay, so this is what we would call the detached mystic, right? So this is the person who can engage with life and be fully committed to life all at the same time while detaching oneself from life and not being emotionally invested in one's life, right? You can feel sympathy, you can have empathy for your neighbor for going through a bad situation, and yet still be objective in knowing that that bad situation was something that they caused for themselves. It's something that they're going to have to work through. It's something that they're going to have to figure out. And you can be understanding to that and compassionate to that without losing your sense of self. There are so many people who are so empathetic, so sympathetic, that they lose their spiritual autonomy because they literally dissolve themselves into the problems of the other. Right. So, this is a state of mind, this transitional state of mind of kind of riding the pendulum. You sit your ass down on the pendulum and you allow yourself to swing from these external, fluctuations and the internal truths. And you let yourself kind of flow back and forth between the two. And you allow both of these to inform the other so as to have you maintain a discerning and detached state of being. Does that make sense? I hope it does. Okay. Okay. So such operations of the soul are interesting to study and analyze, but they have been the cause of much misunderstanding. Moses, Isaiah, Paul, Muhammad, Zoroaster, Swedenborg were all more or less in a transition state of mind, which is an intermediate between the mental slavery and mental liberty. More correctly, it is a state in which the soul is strongly sympathetic with the hereditary impressions educational convictions, and prevailing forms of belief, while it exhibits also a kind of consistency and independence of thought in proportion to the preponderance of orderly faculties in the mental structure. Okay? The next state is called the somnambulistic state. We hear about this a lot in Allan Kardec's The Spirits book, and even more so in Allan Kardec's The Mediums book, to describe different types of mediums. But now, in this particular case, because this book came before Allan Kardec, in this particular case, we are looking at a state of being, right? And so this may be laid down as a principle of mental science that the sympathetic, psychological, transitional, and somnambulistic moods are variations of the mind in its rudimental condition, on the principle that the lowest degree of everything in nature contains the highest in a latent or underdeveloped state. And as regards the present subject, we must keep is our minds upon the twofold nature of man, remembering that besides the material or visible organs of sense, he is endowed with corresponding internal senses, of which the nervous system is the magnetic plexus, or the wires that connect the interior being with the objective world. The nervous system may be considered a kind of bridge upon which the exact images of outward objects and and influences travel into sensorium. Okay? Should the external senses be confused or deadened, the internal organs of sensibility become, under certain circumstances, intensified in their capabilities and perform alone the functions common to those of the external body. The vital principle, which pervades normally the external proportions of the organism, is now transferred to its interior departments, conducting impressions of the most delicate character to the mind. The impressions are very distinct and delightful because the attention and sensibilities of the mind are no longer distracted by the intrusion of impressions from the outer world. This state is somnambulism. It may be considered an incipient manifestation of the spiritual faculties and the first demonstration of the independence of the soul. It may be produced naturally or superinduced by manipulations, but however obtained, the results are the same, invariably, though often different in degree. While some persons in this condition exhibit little perception or powers of accomplishment, others manifest much more than their usual clearness of intellect and energy of muscle. But in nearly all cases, the same individual, when awake and when in when in somnambulism, appears like two entirely different personalities. Although the same in character and a state which can be developed easily into one of high mental illumination, somnambulism is not clairvoyance except in a rudimentary sense. While the somnambulist can move about in light or darkness with confidence and security, avoiding all objects in his path, the clairvoyant, on a higher plane of perception, can extend his vision far into the life of things and can survey the interior of the earth, the human body, and the soul. On the other hand, the somnambulist may obtain no impressions or knowledge from the spirit land. He can, however, perform things of which he is incapable in his ordinary condition. The expose and I'm sorry, of his ordinary condition, and expose himself fearlessly to the dangers from which he would shrink otherwise. He reads, writes, sings, plays, thinks, reasons, not only as if he had the use of his corporal senses, but as if the acuteness of his natural faculties were increased through emancipation from organic thraldom. It should be fostered, therefore, with religious reverence. It refers to our deepest vitality and casts light upon our future destiny. It does not rely on any solitary or partial claim to consideration. Its roots run far beneath and throughout the general ground of humanity, and it invests the temple of nature with new significance. The next state is called the clairvoyant state. The clairvoyant state. So, let me take a quick sip before I move into. You guys, it is so freaking hot today. It is so freaking hot today. This cold water feels amazing. Okay. So, clairvoyance is the complete development of somnambulism, an expansion of the same state. It is one of high mental exaltation, though here also there may be a considerable degree of accuracy without the subject perceiving anything which pertains to the world of spirits. It is, however, an interior state wherein it is easy to discover the hidden beauties and dynamics of creation. Whether naturally or artificially induced, the clairvoyant obtains a clearer knowledge of his own mental and bodily condition. He can diagnose disease and prescribe effectual remedies. He possesses all powers of somnambulists in a much higher degree of intensification and availability, while the ordinary sleepwalker has only a portion of his mind under his own control. The clairvoyant is in possession of all his voluntary powers, except those appertaining to muscular motion merely, to which, however, there are certain rare exceptions. Okay? And then lastly, it's the spiritual state. This is mental illumination, that which brings the soul into very close proximity with the interior life, a life which holds communion with the sanctified. It is a high reality, an expansion of the mind's energies, a subjugation of material to spiritual, of body to soul. This superior condition is the flower of clairvoyance, and because of its infrequent occurrence, it might be termed a century plant, which blooms once in 100 years. It is the fruit of a large and beautiful tree, the root of which is the rudimental state. The body is human magnetism, the branches are somnambulism, and the buds are clairvoyance in all its developments. The spiritual state grows upon the summit of this tree as naturally as the peach succeeds the blossom. Its causes are confined mainly within the constitution of the mind. The individual must have an organic and hereditary proclivity thereto. The temperament must be firm, high toned, and well balanced. Vital and mental irritability are incompatible with this condition, and no turbulent disposition can attain it. The soul must be calm as the morning and full of integrity. The passions must be soft and tranquil as an evening zephyr, while harmony must preside over the sensibilities. The spiritual state is rare because the circumstances indispensable to its development are as infrequent as they are little comprehended. It signifies an opening of the interior understanding and an exercise of interior perceptions. In this condition, the spirit not only sees but comprehends. The love and wisdom principles have a harmonious interaction. The mind sees, hears, reasons, understands, and the whole interior man is concordantly exalted. Social and intellectual elements are, however, subordinate to the religious faculties, though the illumination of all elements is equal. When a human mind is truly in the spiritual state, which corresponds to death on the outer and harmonious mental development on the inner, the spiritual world will pour its love and wisdom into the perceptions of the illuminated soul. The spiritual world does not come to us, we go thereto. When mind attains that certain degree in development, which is in harmony with the laws, desires, love, and wisdom of the spirit land, its inhabitants are ready to introduce the heavenly light and heat of their own souls into the prepared soul on earth, though such soul may not be so high or good as the source of influx. The prerequisite is harmony, understood as the condition rather than the degree thereof. When a mind is substantially in the spiritual state, the upper portions of the head are beautifully illuminated. The superior divisions of the social and intellectual faculties glow with a mellow light centered in the moral faculties and extending upward about 4 feet. The upper portion of this light is generally some 20 inches in diameter and variegated as the rainbow, indicating the different kinds of love and wisdom excited by the illumination. This light is derived wholly from the interior elements of the soul. And when the body is demagnetized or rendered comparatively insensible by a transfer of positive power from external to internal, from external to internal surfaces, the life of the body flows up into the mind, and the soul's elements experience a corresponding elevation. Into the bosom of this light flow the breathings of love circles, or wisdom circles. Sorry, I gotta do this really quick. Hold on. Okay. I had to let TikTok know that I was still on here. Okay. As the law of use may prescribe at the time. Most profound thoughts and contemplations may be introduced into the mind, accompanied through, not always, with the gift of expression in language. But a mind in the spiritual state is not entirely dependent on the spirit land for great thoughts and revelations. Possessing somnambulistic and clairvoyant powers while understanding that which is perceived, it can penetrate the constitution of nature, the deep things of science and philosophies, the beings of this earth and those of distant stars, incarnate and discarnate humanity. Independently of direct influx from the spirit world, the mind in this state has a wide field open before it. While under development from the spirit land, it can be caught up into the third heaven to meditate on the stupendous arcana of spiritual habitations. And at the same time, it does not leave the body utterly until after death. Though the physical frame may present all outward appearances of such desertion, and the subject himself is frequently deceived on this point, it should be remembered further that in some peculiarly organized minds, spiritual impressions may be enjoyed apart from spiritual perceptions, and vice versa, as in cases of good clairvoyance. And lastly, the spiritual state is a religious condition. All true prophets and seers of olden times entered therein. All right. So let's go back and read the footnotes of this chapter before we end it and open it up to questions. All right. Gotta go back. Okay. So this chapter was taken mostly from the Great Harmonia. And it says here, here it is. Okay. It follows that man is a tripyrite, a body within a body and a soul interior of both. This point should be noted in view of certain distinctions which will have to be made subsequently. So basically there's three bodies. There's the physical body, the spirit body, and the soul. Okay? It is even said that there are souls which appear in spirit, meaning as they are beheld occasionally in the state of psychic vision, like the lean kine of Pharaoh, poor and half starved. They are really and substantially small, contracted, parsimonious, exciting simultaneously our pity and contempt. In such a nature, there is a radical deficiency of substance. It gives off no vitalizing emanations. The alleged quality of souls is resident, therefore, in the qualities of the germinal essence, but not in the quantity of spiritual principles whereby is built up the temple of mental being. All men begin with the same principles of human existence: motion, life, sensation, intelligence, or love, knowledge, and wisdom. But the proportion varies in different types of men. The standard of measurement, like the substance to be measured, is, however, altogether spiritual, and there is nothing to show that deficiency of spirituality is determinable by any physical standard. A large or small structure and standard is no indication of a great or diminutive mind, nor is it entirely a question of temperament, education, or situation. It is inherent and essential. So, what they're saying here, and according to the Great Harmonia, is that if you are someone with great mental faculties, if you, are full, and if you follow the laws of motion, life, sensation, intelligence, love, knowledge, and wisdom, if you find yourself as a clairvoyant person or a spiritual person, there is no outward there's nothing outward about you that would indicate that you have those things, right? So the judgment of those things are going to be judged in spirit. So I can't look at you and say, oh, you're a spiritual person because you're skinny and not fat, or because you're a vegetarian and you don't eat meat, or because you are someone who doesn't curse versus someone who does. Like, those things don't make anybody spiritual or clairvoyant or gifted or anything like that. Those are just outward expressions, outward characteristics. However, according to these standards, when you move in these places, when you move in these higher spiritual mental states, because you've moved through the hierarchy, um, you would hopefully release some of these more basic natures of human characteristics and external expressions, mainly because you won't feel the need to express them in that way. Okay, let's move on to the next one. Insofar as this is an acceptable diagnosis, the sympathetic state must be in close root relation with the other and ex hypothesis higher state, which is classed subsequently as somnambulistic. There are, however, two kinds of sympathy, and in the present case, it is needful to distinguish them one from another. There is that which Davis is treating, which is of sense and the physical side, or magnetic, being attractive according to the literal meaning of the word. It connects with our instinctive use of the term atmosphere to describe something which encompasses certain people, which seems to otherwise to escape definition. But there is also an intellectual sympathy, and the word magnetic does not apply thereto without a change in its meaning. There is no question that the word sympathy in both these aspects corresponds to something very real in personal characteristics, and it is described adequately in the text above. It must be said that the diagnosis in this instance seems purely arbitrary or fantastic. Alternatively, the use of the term transitional is singularly misapplied, and we have to remember that Davis, not only when he dictated the principles of nature, but at the period of the Great Harmonia, was an untutored young man who had little substantial help from books or schooling. If his transitional state is intermediate between that of sympathy and that of somnambulism, it is no less uncritical and no less nihil ad rem to describe that one as bondage than the other as liberation. To be in sympathy is not to be enslaved and to walk in one's sleep in the literal sense of the word. Somnambulism is a maniacal definition of liberty. The one is a normal condition of every human being, while the other is a pathological state, or alternatively, is artificial and induced. Throughout the latter part of his classification, the word values and diagnoses of Davis are in a state of chaos. He is really trying to describe the history of a mind in its passage from preconceived opinion to a life of free thought, distinguished by elementary inward experiences. We compare the Great Harmonia, where it is said that somnambulism is clairvoyance undeveloped. The suggestion that simple somnambulism can either rudimentary or develop clairvoyance may appear strange to the informed reader, but several denominations adopted in this section are instances of inexact phraseology, characteristic of an imperfectly trained mind, which may yet have great lights. Care is recommended to the reader in the consideration of this section, on which one would think Davis himself had expanded more than his usual care. On the part of the present editor, it has been surmised, after patient research, in the first place, it should be realized that a state, however denominated, which demands hereditary predisposition for its attainment, is not spiritual in the sense that has attached to the word through all the Christian ages, not to speak of earlier epochs. It is really described quite correctly as the flower of clairvoyance, by which we are enabled to see that it is spiritual in the sense of spiritualism or mediumistic in conventional parlance. When it is said, therefore, at the inception that the life under examination is one that holds communion with the sanctified, this is to be understood of as the kind which is postulated by Davis as pertaining to the disembodied humanities who communicate with persons on earth. According to the inference following from his personal experience and according to the records of mediumship. So ultimately, he's talking about this type of mediumship, this type of unification with God, this type of mental faculty of this high spiritual state that Davis talks about it being hereditary, that not everyone has this. And what the compiler of this author is trying to say is that that's not what he really is talking about. He is talking about the ability to be unified with God is something that is inherently in all of us, because again, the rule of the nature of law is that anything that exists in the highest degree also exists in rudimentary degrees, just in an undeveloped state, right? And so we all have this ability. However, this ability to interact with disembodied spirits may be something that you need more work to do, that it's not something that is going to come to you and may not come to you in this lifetime. And so it was Davis's misconception that it might just be hereditary, right? And that there's no and according to this author, if we're talking about spiritual things supposedly are high spiritual things are supposedly removed from material restrictions. And so to say that you must have this in your bloodline or you must have a hereditary predisposition to a particular spiritual faculty is a false and would defy the laws of the nature that he himself had written. Okay. Anyway, so the distinctions in this brief analysis are not to be understood as established for ulterior purpose. The spiritual state of the Poughkeepsie seer is not the spiritual state of St. Thomas of Kempis or St. John of the Cross or Eckhart or Reyesbrock. Here is above all a memoir in summary form of conditions to which Davis believed that he had attained personally, the issue having been cleared to this extent for the service of readers who might be otherwise in a state of interstitude, and it may be left a threat. Okay? Okay, let me go back. All right, and that was it. So now we are on chapter 3 of book 3, but we are not going to read that today. Instead, we are going to open it up to the public and to your questions. Hello, hello. Okay. I need a break. So now we are open to spiritual questions or questions about what we had just read. You let me know. Ooh, hello, hello. Really? You got no questions? I'm surprised. That was a very meaty chapter. I am surprised. Okay. Well, if there are no questions, I want to say thank you guys so much for hanging out with me for our book club. Again, we normally do our book clubs on Tuesdays. Today was a rare exception. So meet me next Tuesday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on all my socials at The Magical Solution so we can continue reading this book together. If you want to continue talking about spiritual things with very like-minded people, make sure you go to Facebook, join my private Facebook groups. You will meet wonderful people who will have wonderful conversations with you. Those of you who are advanced mediums, advanced spiritualists, who are seeking development spaces, make sure you check out my misas that I hold every Sunday at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, and we develop our faculties together. We give light to each other. It's a beautiful experience, and I invite you all to pop in if you get a chance on a Sunday morning, okay? Anyways, once again, thank you so much for hanging out with me. My name is Leilani. This is The Magical Solution. This is how we grow. Thank you so much for watching. Have a good night, everybody.